and I showed him the change of the commandments and all these things. And then he said to me, I can't talk to you on this issue because I'm not into Scripture at all. And I was stunned. Here was a priest and he was not into Scripture. He says, we have some specialists who are into Scripture. But it doesn't make any sense to me, he says. And then he left. And then I had the ministers of other churches, and we argued right sometimes till the late hours of the night as to what the little horn was. And every time they come back to Antiochus Epiphanes, I'd show them, but it can't be because he comes after Rome, etc. It can't be in Greek times. And eventually they would all leave as well and say it can't be any other way. So I was confronted with this tremendous dilemma. And then the worst thing of all was, we started talking about the Sabbath, this other man and I. And we went through the whole Sabbath thing, and then I said to him, but this is ridiculous. How can you keep a commandment which you keep because the Lord created in 6 days, the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is? That's ludicrous. Everything came into existence through evolution. And he said, no. It came into existence through creation. God created it. You know, and the little girl pops up into my mind. And I said to him, but that's rubbish. He says, I'll prove it to you. I said, you try. And he tried. The next day he was at my house with a pile of books like this, all on creationism, and he gave them to me. And I remember going through those books. I was sitting in my office. I used to give my class and run back, and I went through those books very quickly. And I gave them back to him in a very short time period and said, there are your books. And he says, what do you think? I said, I've never read so much garbage in all my life. So I said, don't worry. And he brought me another pile like that. And I went through that lot, and it was so confusing and so full of garbage. So I gave it back to him. And I said, it's so unscientific. I cannot accept this. So we argued about God being a creator or not a creator, and I would kill him with science. I had all the terminology. I was a lecturer. I was an evolutionist. I knew what to tell these people. I've been trained to wipe out people who oppose, the scientist on any of these fields. And he got so frustrated with me. And then one day he was so frustrated, he said, you know what? I said, what? He says, I haven't got a problem with evolution creation. You have a problem. You solve it. So there the ball was in my court. In the meantime, things were happening again in my house. The little one would again become miserable every time it was time for bedtime. He again became grouchy and screaming and what have you. And we also noticed that whenever we had a moment of peace, my wife and I, we studied the scriptures like, I cannot tell you how we studied it. I finished a Bible. In 2 months I had to throw it away. It was finished. It fell apart. And my wife was studying. And she had tremendous problems with the Sabbath idea. It made no sense. It was so stupid. And nobody at work knew what was happening with me. And one day I came to work, and the secretary in the department came up to me and said, I've got something for you to read. And she handed me a pile about so thick of documents. And when I looked at them in a spare moment, I saw that it was a long piece of writing against the Sabbath. And it was written against Seventh-day Adventists. And this stunned me because nobody at work knew what was happening with me. I mean, a scientist would never admit, that he's now talking about and thinking about religion. That was ridiculous. My colleagues were all atheists. And I took this and I thought to myself, now what am I going to do with this? I haven't got time with this. I'm wrestling with evolution. So I gave it to my wife. And I said, here's fodder. You go through this. Maybe there's a way out of all this. And she meticulously went through every statement. It was really a thick, thick thing written against it. And while I was wrestling with evolution, she was wrestling with that. And then one day she said to me, you know, I've been through every single statement they have. And every single one, I've put it next to the Bible. And every time, this is the word of man and the Bible has something else to say. So this document here has now convinced me that the Sabbath must be right. That was something. So a document written against the Sabbath proved to her that the Sabbath was actually very important and right. But I still had a problem. A major problem. I couldn't accept it because I'm not going to keep a day for creation that took 6 billion years, let alone 6 days. And the ball was in my court, and at that stage, everything started going wrong again in my house. And when we picked up the Bible, the little one would go hysterical. Whenever we had a spare moment, he would go hysterical. And eventually, he took a bottle of wine, we'd been drinking wine, and he smashed it. I wasn't in the room at the time, but I just heard the glass breaking. And then we came out and he was walking all over the glass. And his feet were cut to shreds. His big toe was almost severed. So back to hospital, they sewed the toe back on, and it was a nightmare from then onwards in our house. And I was wrestling with the Sabbath issue. And I stood in the library one day. We had the biggest evolution-based library in the Southern Hemisphere at that university. And I said to myself, you know, there must be a solution. And I said in my mind, God, if there is something wrong with this theory of evolution, then I haven't found it yet, and you must show me. Because nobody else can show me. And I went into this library, took out a book. And as I walked out the door, a colleague stopped me and he said, hold it. There's another book you must take, which is the same book as that one, but the new edition, it's on the back shelf. Very strange. So I went to the back and I took that edition as well. I took them both and I went to my office. And then I started reading. But I started reading them both at the same time. And then as I looked at the one, the old edition would say that there is a major problem with the cetaceans, with the whales, because they appear suddenly in the fossil record fully formed. And there is no evidence that the one gave rise to the other. The new edition would couch it all in scientific terminology, would say cetaceans have an ancient origin and evolved from such and such to such and such and such and such and such and such. And I went through them, one model after the other, and the old one would admit to the problem, the new one would never admit to the problem. And that's when I started thinking, wait, there's something wrong here. There's something fishy here. And whenever I went into the library, it was if some miracle would happen. I would take out something, and the very next thing I would take would be exactly the opposite on the same issue. And very quickly, I had a big pile. And then I was giving classes at that time in genetics, and I started thinking about this. And then I started working out this genetic thing, and much as like we did over here. And I started thinking about what are the problems. Let me now objectively, just for once, sit down and think, what are the problems? And I came up with such a pile of problems that it stunned me. And something must have been helping me, because the problem list was so enormous, it was unbelievable. And then one night I was sitting at home, and child was impossible. He went to bed, and we went to bed. 2 o'clock at night, I had a dream. I was being strangled. And the little one screamed in the next room, and we ran, and the same thing happened. But he didn't get so sick that he had to go to hospital. He just got a very high fever, and we could handle it somehow at home. And then I contacted this other person, and I said to him, you know, there's something very strange here. I know that from the scriptures, the system, the Roman Catholic system, cannot be God's system. And yet, we had this problem, and I didn't want to tell him about it. And then in the end, I half told him about it, but not completely. And he said, don't worry, we'll pray. And it stopped. And then a week later, it happened again at 2 o'clock. And what had happened, unbeknown to me, he had gotten a number of people together and told them to pray at 2 o'clock every night. Get up. And they set their alarms judiciously and got up at 2 o'clock and prayed for a family they didn't even know.